Tonight, a shocking development in what some are calling the most disturbing crime ever committed behind prison walls. A seasoned correctional officer, trusted to enforce the rules, now accused of breaking the most unthinkable one, murder. The details are chilling. The victim, an inmate who, by all accounts, should have been safe. The suspect, the very person tasked with keeping him alive. But what led to this brutal act? Was it revenge? A desperate cover-up? Or something far more complicated? Tonight, we take you inside the walls of San Quentin State Prison, California, where this shocking crime unfolded. We'll uncover the truth about Henry, a man who was once seen as a model officer, now facing a murder charge that has left investigators searching for answers. And at the center of it all, an affair no one saw coming. A dangerous secret that, once exposed, left one person dead and another fighting for their freedom. Stay with us as we unravel this complex case, piece by piece. And if you don't want to miss more gripping true crime stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's get into it. To those who worked alongside him, Officer's name was the definition of authority. A career correctional officer with 12 years of experience, he had a reputation for discipline, control, and keeping order behind bars. Hired at San Quentin State Prison in 2016, he worked his way up, earning the respect of his colleagues and the trust of prison administrators. Some said he had a strict but fair approach, a man who understood the dangers of working inside one of the state's most unforgiving facilities. He knew the job. He wasn't someone you'd think would ever cross the line. But you never really know someone, do you? On the other side of the bars was Oliver, a man whose record was anything but clean. Convicted of rape, he had been serving a 5-year term at San Quentin State Prison. Unlike the hardened gang leaders or career criminals who ruled the cell blocks, Oliver had a different kind of presence. Some saw him as charming, others as manipulative. He knew how to work the system, how to read people, and, most importantly, how to get what he wanted. Prosecutors painted him as a smooth talker, someone who could turn a bad situation to his advantage. And inside prison, that skill became even more valuable. He wasn't just another inmate. He was a survivor, someone who learned how to navigate the system from the inside. The first sign of something unusual came in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A lingering glance. A conversation held just a little too long. Officers and inmates alike began to notice that Henry and Oliver interacted more than expected. At first, it seemed harmless. But those paying close attention started to realize this wasn't just about professional duty. It was something else entirely. A former inmate said, "Man, I saw it. He'd stop by his cell more often than he did for anyone else. No reason, just standing there, talking low. At first, I thought maybe they had some kind of deal going on, but then, it got weird." Then came the notes. Small pieces of folded paper, passed discreetly. Messages that, at first, seemed innocent, but held something much deeper. Love letters, written in careful, hidden language. The kind of words that had no place inside a prison. The risk was enormous. A relationship between a correctional officer and an inmate wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. But for reasons no one could quite understand, Henry ignored the danger. He had everything to lose. And yet, he kept going. Other officers started to take notice. Some whispered about favoritism. Others saw the subtle but undeniable changes. Oliver receiving better work assignments, access to privileges other inmates could only dream of. And then, there were the moments that couldn't be explained. Extra time outside his cell. Late-night visits when no one else was around. A former guard speak out. "Listen, I've worked in this place for years. You see things. You hear things. But this was different. Officers don't risk their careers for just anyone. There was something going on between them, something they thought no one else would ever find out. But secrets don't stay buried in prison. Someone always talks. And when they did, the truth about their forbidden relationship started to unravel. The question was, how far would they go to keep it hidden? The inmate wanted out. Desperation clung to him like a shadow, growing darker with each passing day. He had tried the official channels, filed appeals, and spoken with attorneys, but nothing moved fast enough. So, he turned to the one thing he knew best: manipulation. There were whispers among the inmates, quiet speculations about a secret he held. A secret that could bring an officer to his knees. Some believed it was blackmail, a weapon sharpened over time. Others thought it was mere bluffing, an attempt to push his way to freedom. But something had changed. The officer's demeanor was proof enough. The pressure mounted, unseen but suffocating. The officer, once composed, began to unravel. The smallest inconveniences set him off. His tone sharpened, his patience frayed. He avoided certain halls, kept his back to the walls, flinched at the sound of his own name. There was something in his eyes, a restlessness, a quiet panic that hadn't been there before. Reports circulated among the staff. Uncharacteristic aggression. A short temper. Increased tension in his interactions. He no longer lingered in the break room. Conversations were brief, clipped, as if words had become dangerous. It was as though he expected someone to be watching, listening, waiting for him to slip. The security logs painted an even more troubling picture. His keycard had been used in restricted areas, places where he had no business being. The surveillance room. The record-keeping office. Small gaps in footage, a few minutes missing here and there, easily dismissed at first, but harder to ignore when the pattern emerged. Then there was the inmate. He had been seen near locked doors, places where only an officer's clearance could grant access. He was pushing boundaries, testing limits. And yet, no reports had been filed against him. No disciplinary action had been taken. It was as if he had been given silent permission to roam just a little too far. Something was unraveling inside those prison walls, a slow and quiet decay. The officer was slipping. The inmate was watching. And somewhere in between, the truth waited to surface. The prison was supposed to be locked down for the night. The usual hum of distant voices had faded, replaced by the mechanical hum of flickering fluorescent lights. But somewhere deep within the facility, past the rows of barred cells and the deafening silence of solitary confinement, something terrible had just happened. At precisely 2:17 a.m., a guard making routine rounds discovered the body of inmate Oliver slumped in the far corner of his cell. His body was motionless, unnaturally still, as if he had been positioned there deliberately. His face was partially obscured by the dim lighting, but there was no mistaking the unsettling stillness of death. The scene was eerily quiet, save for the occasional distant clang of metal doors and the soft, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor from the medical wing. The initial assumption: suicide. A bedsheet wrapped tightly around the inmate's throat, his body angled just enough to make it look plausible. A desperate escape from life behind bars, or so it seemed. But something wasn't right. The positioning of the body. The lack of signs that he had struggled. And most of all, the absence of deep ligature marks, the kind that should have been there if he had truly hanged himself. The moment the prison warden arrived, something was already off. The door to the cell, usually bolted shut, had been unlocked. Not forced open, not tampered with. Simply unlocked. And according to the logs, there had been no reason for anyone to enter the cell that night. The inmate was supposed to be alone. Yet, here he was, lifeless. A closer examination of the body revealed even more disturbing details. His knuckles bore no signs of struggle. No defensive wounds. No broken nails, no torn clothing, nothing to indicate that he had fought for his life. His lips were slightly parted, as if he had tried to say something in his final moments. And then there was the most chilling discovery of all, a faint trace of bruising, not on his neck, but around his wrists. As if someone had restrained him before his death. It didn't take long before the real questions started. The surveillance system was supposed to cover every inch of the prison, and yet, for some reason, the footage from the past 4 hours was missing. Gone. The official report stated a malfunction, but the likelihood of that happening, especially at such a crucial moment, was almost impossible. Even more unsettling, the logbooks had been altered. The records showed that no guards had entered the cell block at the time of the murder. No movements were recorded. No patrols. No interactions. The inmate had simply died, according to the paperwork. But someone had to have been there. Someone had to have seen something. And then there was the matter of the missing body cam footage. Protocol dictated that guards wear them at all times during rounds, yet several officers conveniently had their cameras turned off that night. A coincidence? Or something far more calculated? Just hours before his death, the inmate had been seen speaking with another prisoner, one who had since been placed in solitary confinement for security reasons. Whatever was said between them, it had been brief but intense. The guards on duty reported seeing the inmate looking anxious afterward, pacing his cell like a man who knew something was coming. At 11:45 p.m., a meal tray had been slid into his cell. He barely touched it. At 12:30 a.m., a guard was seen walking past his cell but never stopping. And then, nothing. Silence. Until 2:17 a.m., when the body was discovered. One guard in particular stood out. Officer Henry. His shift had ended at 2 a.m., just minutes before the body was found. Yet, instead of clocking out, he lingered near the surveillance room, speaking in hushed tones with another officer. When asked about the missing footage, he simply shrugged, saying the cameras had been acting up all week. Later that morning, he called in sick. Didn't return to work for 3 days. And when he did, his demeanor had changed. He was quieter, avoided eye contact, and most notably, he never spoke about the murder. Not once. Someone inside that prison knew exactly what had happened. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it look like an accident. And someone was working hard to make sure the truth never saw the light of day. But the truth has a way of coming out. And this murder, it was only the beginning. At first, the officer's version of events seemed plausible, routine, even. But inconsistencies began to surface, raising quiet yet insistent doubts among investigators. His timeline shifted slightly between interviews, minor details contradicted one another, and when pressed about his actions in the moments leading up to the inmate's death, his responses grew increasingly vague. Detectives meticulously combed through security footage, searching for any discrepancy. The grainy black and white images painted a troubling picture. Movements that didn't align with the officer's statements, stretches of time unaccounted for, and shadows cast in places they shouldn't be. The final minutes before the inmate was found lifeless became the focal point of scrutiny. Then came the autopsy. The report was damning. The official cause of death contradicted what had been initially reported. What was supposed to be an accident now bore the marks of something far more sinister. The medical examiner noted bruising in places that suggested a struggle, pressure marks that hinted at asphyxiation. There were injuries inconsistent with self-harm or natural causes. The findings left no doubt. This was no simple case of misfortune. Whispers spread within the facility. Some officers stayed silent, unwilling to involve themselves. But others, whether out of guilt, fear, or a desire for justice, began to speak. One officer recalled hearing muffled sounds in the corridor, something that might have been a scuffle. An inmate, reluctant at first, later admitted he had seen shadows moving frantically under the cell door gap, heard desperate gasps that suddenly stopped. But it was what detectives found next that shattered the case wide open. Buried within phone records, text messages, and personal letters was the undeniable truth: the officer had been having an affair. Illicit meetings, unauthorized visits, exchanged glances that had gone unnoticed until now. The affair alone was a violation of conduct, but it was what these messages revealed that was truly damning. Words of desperation, fear, threats. A tangled web of emotions laid bare in digital form. The officer had secrets, ones he had fought to keep buried. And as investigators pieced together the puzzle, one chilling question remained. Was this inmate silenced to protect those secrets? The case was no longer about inconsistencies. It was about motive. And now, the hunt for the truth had taken a far darker turn. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the tension of what had become the most sensational trial in recent history. The officer, once a respected figure in law enforcement, now sat at the defense table, his face impassive, yet his fingers twitched ever so slightly against the cold wooden surface. It had all come crashing down the moment investigators uncovered key evidence linking him to the inmate's death. There was no outright confession, no tearful admission of guilt, but the case against him was built on a web of damning circumstantial evidence. Surveillance footage had captured the officer's final moments with the inmate. Witnesses, fellow officers, and even inmates themselves recounted suspicious behavior, inconsistencies in his timeline, and the eerie silence that followed the fatal night. A text message exchange between the officer and the inmate, revealed during the investigation, hinted at a relationship far deeper than professional. The turning point, however, was the discovery of the officer's fingerprints on a hidden object found near the crime scene, an item that should never have been there. The prosecution argued that this was the key to unlocking the truth. Was this a crime of passion, a moment of panic, or something far more sinister? The trial gripped the nation. Prosecutors painted a devastating picture: a respected officer, drawn into a dangerous affair, manipulated by a convicted felon, only for it all to end in betrayal. They argued that the officer, fearing exposure, had taken matters into his own hands. Witness after witness took the stand. A fellow officer recalled seeing the accused in the restricted area moments before the inmate was found lifeless. A forensic expert detailed the timeline, pointing to inconsistencies in the officer's statements. And then, the most damning evidence: the prosecution played security footage showing a shadowy figure, unmistakably the defendant, lingering outside the inmate's cell just minutes before the alarm was sounded. But the defense was relentless. They argued that their client was being used as a scapegoat, that the real culprit had yet to be found. They suggested that the evidence was circumstantial at best and fabricated at worst. The officer's lawyer dissected every inconsistency in the prosecution's case, pointing out the lack of a clear motive beyond the alleged affair, which they dismissed as nothing more than speculation. Was this a tragic accident? A setup? The defense insisted that the officer had been framed, that someone, possibly another inmate or even a fellow officer, had orchestrated the entire event to make him the fall. And that brings us to the bigger question: what does this case reveal about corruption within the prison system? Was it just one officer's lapse in judgment, or does it point to a deeper, systemic issue? It's not the first time we've seen cases like this. Across the country, there have been numerous reports of inappropriate relationships between officers and inmates, some leading to contraband smuggling, escape attempts, or even violent consequences. When power dynamics are abused behind bars, the lines between authority and criminal behavior blur. But what do you think? Was justice truly served in this case, or is there more to the story? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into true crime. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.